Hello everybody and welcome back to Crossplay Gaming. My name is Eric if you're new to the channel, and in this video we're going to talk about the topic of which video games should Christians play. So I hope you'll join me. Let's go ahead and get started. So this is definitely a theme I've touched on before in previous videos. Early on in the channel, one of my more popular videos was called The Christian in Gaming. Maybe you've seen it. I'll leave a link at the end of the video for that if you're interested. But the main point of that video was really to talk about where sort of the stigma surrounding gaming came from in the Christian community and how we might overcome it, but also have a proper place for gaming in the Christian life. I also did a more broad video on the Christian and entertainment in general. I can leave a link to that as well. So again, there will be some overlap in terms of themes covered in those videos and themes covered in this video, but I really wanted to focus down on gaming in this video. One of the really common questions I tend to get in comment sections on my YouTube videos and things like that is, what do you think of this game? Should Christians play this game? Can you give your thoughts on this or that? And that leads to a few different issues. One thing is, I don't think it's necessarily healthy for Christians to have one single like YouTube guru that they go to say, you can play this game or you can't play that game. Still, I will say there are definitely games I would warn against if we were to get really specific, but I'm not going to name any in this video per se. What I really want to do in this video is give you more a set of principles that you can carry through your Christian life as you approach different video games, if it's a hobby you enjoy, so that you can pick games that really more align with your conscience and with your biblical and Christian convictions, but so that it's done in a way that you are able to do that discerning yourself. I want to do it this way, not just because I think it's better for you as you grow as a Christian, but also because I don't have that wide of a range of interests in gaming. My interests are pretty narrow. I like some retro games, retro shooters, retro puzzle games. I like some Switch games, and I like a few modern franchises, but ultimately, you know, I have my own range of games I'm interested in, so I can't comment on every game that people ask about. So let's go ahead and get started on what I do have to share. One thing I think that a lot of Christian gamers can agree on is that there have been a lot of really negative and unhealthy ways that Christians have practiced discernment surrounding gaming. Personally, I think this is often because Christians will try to discern games, but they'll do so in a really one-dimensional kind of way. I think this is pretty sad because I think particularly in the West, it used to be the Christians who would be the creators of culture. They were the authors of some of the great books and the great fiction and nonfiction. But I ultimately don't think this is so much the case today, although I hope we eventually can recover this to some extent. I remember back around like the 80s and 90s, there was what was called the Satanic Panic. And there was a time when Christians were really going after all kinds of games and things that kids were playing, and they were unaware of the actual intentions of the creators of a lot of these things. So for instance, I'm not sure many of you are aware, but one really controversial game, Dungeons and Dragons, was actually created by a Christian who was really shocked at the response that came out of his game and was really disappointed with the way a lot of that turned out. He actually took a lot of the creatures and themes in Dungeons and Dragons from The Lord of the Rings, and that book, as many of you might know, was authored by a Roman Catholic. Now, I'm a Protestant, and many of you watching probably are as well, and so you'd have your own set of objections to Roman Catholicism, but that's different from having an objection to something that is meant to promote something demonic. Clearly, that was not the intention of The Lord of the Rings, and because Dungeons and Dragons was based on that, that wasn't the intention of the creator of that game. And another, I think, even more controversial example of this would be Harry Potter. Now, that was a really controversial set of books and movies when I was growing up, and I wasn't aware, and many Christians were not aware, that the author of Harry Potter was actually, by her own admission, inspired by a lot of themes in the New Testament. I guess she was known to have said that if you knew the ending of the Bible, you probably could guess the ending of her book. A lot of Christians don't know about that. Now, again, I'll qualify that and say that J.K. Rowling is very left-leaning politically and would hold to a lot of positions that I would not consider to be Christian. But again, objecting to that would be different from objecting to a claim that she's trying to promote the occult or witchcraft in her book by having these surface-level themes of magic when those themes actually have an underlying theme that she says comes from, again, the New Testament and biblical themes. And maybe you don't buy into that. Maybe you would still object to something like Harry Potter, but many Christians who do would then turn around and still be in favor of a series like The Chronicles of Narnia, which also has a lot of themes of magic and things like that. And maybe that's because the symbolism is more explicitly Christian and they're much more aware of, say, the faith of C.S. Lewis. So I've just listed some ways where Christians have possibly been frustrated with some possibly one-dimensional thinking in regard to engaging with fiction in the past. But how should we engage with fiction if we shouldn't engage in it in these other ways? One of the things that you'll hear me say very often and when I'm engaging in topics like this is that I think we really need to keep in mind, when it's possible, the intentions of the creators of these works. I think that's really important. It's not always possible, but if we can actually read or find out about or discern from within the work the worldview or the intentions of the one creating these things or the ones creating these things, we should definitely take that into account and make it a central point as we interpret what we're seeing. I think one of the worst violations I've seen of this idea was when I was actually looking at a Christian sort of discernment YouTube channel where in this one instance they were talking about a specific anime show that kids like to watch. And there was this one main sort of lead character that a lot of the other characters would follow. And there was a point, I guess, in the show where the lead character had to leave and go sort of to another dimension and leave these other characters forever. And the other characters sort of looked at him leaving and they said, "It's okay, he'll still be with us in our hearts," basically. And I remember this Christian discernment channel sort of looked at this and they accused these creators of this show of trying to, I guess, teach kids to worship this character in some way, and having this character in their hearts was sort of like having Jesus in their hearts. And they sort of mashed together these ideas to sort of accuse the show of promoting idolatry in some way. And I think this was paired together with all sorts of sort of parallels they drew, supposedly with sort of like symbols in the show with sort of demonic symbols in real life. And a lot of it was really sort of loose connections that they really forced together. And it was really clear that they had no intention of looking into what the creators of the show even intended. Now, if you can't already tell why that example was ridiculous, let me spell it out just a little bit. I mean, this assumes, one, that it's wrong to have a figure in a show that is a deity in some way in this fictional world. I don't even think that was the case in this particular show, but even if it was, even if there was sort of a god of this fictional universe, I mean, have we already agreed that that's wrong? I don't think we have. I mean, we already have fictional works like the Chronicles of Narnia with characters like Aslan who are symbolic of something else. And I'm not saying that this particular anime show actually had Christian creators or that they had any intentions like that, but are we already agreed that if they're not Christians, they can't have these kinds of fictional setups in their worlds? Somehow the creators of this fiction want consumers of this fiction to also worship this deity that the creators themselves clearly don't even believe in? Is that the idea? I don't understand it. Seems ridiculous to me. So in contrast to all that, what I think we do need to do ultimately is to learn to engage with fiction on more than one level. We shouldn't just look at what is happening on one level in the show. We should also look at what is happening under the surface and what are the themes being explored by that surface level story. And I think sometimes we'll find themes and sometimes we'll find that there actually isn't as much depth as we thought there was. And maybe it's just a simple, straightforward piece of fiction without a huge agenda on the part of the creator. And so because I make this distinction between these layers of what are happening in a piece of fiction, that results in me dismissing outright, I think, a lot of the objections Christians often have to many different games. So for instance, is there magic in the story of a game you're playing? Yes. Okay, so then what's the next question? Are the creators of that fiction intending for you to actually believe in that magic? Do the creators themselves believe in that magic? Do they actually want you to step outside of that gaming world and then go practice that in your real life? Or is that magic simply a mechanic to develop the story of the game and your engagement in it? Or even deeper, does it actually symbolize a deeper theme in real life that has nothing to do with actual magic? I see Christians who are willing to do this with fiction in books and movies or other forms of media all the time, but for some reason I've seen Christians unwilling to do this in a game. And under the surface of this, it almost feels like there's sort of a set of assumptions as to how the spiritual realm works that have never even been discussed up front. It's almost as if there's this demonic activity that can happen, and it happens completely separate from the willfulness to sin on the part of the consumer of the media or even the creator of the media. It's like if there is a spiritual component or a magical mechanic in a game, and it has some sort of real-life version outside of the game that we can find, then somehow, even if we have no intention of engaging with that real-life version, somehow a demonic presence or spiritual force can take hold without us having any willingness to engage in that. Now, I don't want to be too dismissive here. I mean, I've heard stories of things like, missionaries who have worked overseas who have engaged with things like witch doctors, who have cursed, physical objects or something, where there was some sort of spiritual activity going on there, and Christians accidentally, came in contact with that in some way. But I think that situations like that are very different than what I'm talking about here, where, for instance, there is no willingness on the part of, again, the creators to engage in any form of this or to promote any form of this spiritual activity. And there's no willingness on the part of the consumer, whether Christian or not, to engage in this sort of thing. These story elements or these mechanics or these themes either represent something else or they have no intended connection with the spiritual realm. And again, there can be a complete almost ignoring of the actual intended part these themes play in the game itself. Now, I've already talked about, for instance, one game I will mention, my favorite franchise, Doom, as you can see behind me here. In the game Doom, there are obviously quote-unquote demonic images and demonic themes and scary environments and monsters that you fight and things like that. But again, what part do these play in the game? These are the enemies in the game. You fight against them. But often a Christian will see the simple fact that these images or these themes or these characters are included, and they'll just draw the connection. Okay, demonic image equals demonic intent on the creator's part in some way, and therefore there's demonic influence and demonic oppression that's immediately going to follow. Now, I've said before, I'm willing to change my mind on these things, but oftentimes these things are just asserted and no argument is made and no one wants to even have a conversation. And so generally, what about violence in video games? Again, oftentimes there's just a lot of assumptions brought in on the part of the Christian and nothing ultimately ends up being discussed. Oftentimes there's almost a presumption of some idea of pacifism on the part of the Christian, that ideas or themes of violence should not even be touched. And oftentimes these things are said by people who outside of the gaming realm are not actually pacifists. So as I've pointed out, I think even in my other videos, even in scripture, we see that in this fallen world, there does seem to be a presentation of different forms of violence. There's like a murderous, evil kind of violence, but then there's also this sort of presentation of heroic combat in different forms in the Old Testament. And these biblical stories really, provoke emotions on the part of the Christian, both positive and negative. We see this sort of rejoicing in justice as there's positive, combat takes place, or we feel this grief when we see negative, murderous things take place. So I struggled to look at that and see inspired scripture present these themes in this way, but then not believe that we can engage these themes and provoke these same emotions in fiction. So with all that being said, what should we actually look out for in video games? So as I've already said, while the overt themes that Christians often object to are pretty benign in my view, there are definitely things that we should look out for. I think more and more these days, there are often times when game developers are beginning to more intentionally and more explicitly put their, political leanings into their games. And oftentimes those cultural or political leanings can ultimately turn out to be pretty anti-Christian. And so I do think we should be aware of that. We've seen things like progressive forms of sexuality or really relativistic forms of truth being promoted, and all of that stuff can end up in games and it should catch our attention. But I would break these sort of objectionable things down into two different categories. There are themes and things in games that can influence us to a non-Christian worldview, but then there are other things that can provoke in us a more visceral non-Christian response. And then having defined those, we need to ask the question, at what point are these things so overwhelming in the game that we should ultimately avoid that game? So like I said before, in that first category, I'd say we do see creators more and more pushing themes and ideas, cultural and political, that do ultimately contradict and fight against the Christian worldview. So the question I have in that situation is, does this theme enter the game sort of as a subplot or a side thing, or is it so central to the game that you can't ultimately follow the story arc and enjoy the story arc without ultimately affirming this non-Christian or even anti-Christian idea. And deciding that ultimately takes a lot of honesty and a lot of maturity. Is it ultimately impossible to feel the emotions the game wants to provoke without affirming the things the game is trying to say? So what about this other category? What things in games can trigger a visceral, non-Christian response? In this category, I would put things like strong sexual content or nudity, or maybe I would place things like strong vulgarity, where you can't enjoy the humor of a game or the overall tone of the game without sort of indulging in these emotions and forms of humor that the game presents, because it's so central to the game. And for some Christians, maybe these violent themes do actually provoke things in you that are ultimately opposed to thinking and feeling like Christ. If you engage in games that include violence or gore or things like that, does that influence the way that you feel and act in real life? I think for some people it does. They become a little bit more agitated. They become more angry in real life. They become less patient. And as a Christian, you need to be honest and mature and decide whether or not you can engage in these things without that happening. And so if a game you're engaging in does include these things like sexuality or nudity or vulgarity, you have to ask yourself, do they take up such a space in the game that they cannot be ultimately ignored? And whether they reach that extent is sort of a matter of Christian conscience. However, I need to be careful in how I say that. I'm definitely not saying that it's a matter of Christian conscience whether or not these things are wrong. They are wrong. But it may be a matter of Christian conscience as to whether or not they can be ignored or overlooked with disapproval while still engaging in the rest of the game. I think this issue is a little bit more complex than a lot of Christians would like to admit. In order to explain that, I could compare this, for instance, to TV and movies. I remember one particular show where a friend of mine decided he was not going to engage in any of this entire series because a couple of the episodes had nudity in them. And I can understand this reasoning because he felt that watching those episodes would support that kind of production, and so he decided to completely withdraw from it. Again, I can see the reasoning there, but I do kind of question where the line is once you begin down that road. So for instance, I like Steven Spielberg movies, and there's one R-rated Steven Spielberg movie I could name where there's nudity in it, but then he also directed a movie like Hook, which is more of a kid's movie. So I could argue that by watching the kid's movie, you're supporting Steven Spielberg, and therefore you're supporting all of his works, and therefore you're supporting the nudity in that R-rated movie. But I don't really see Christians reasoning quite that far. So you have to ask yourself, do you draw that kind of connection? And you have to decide how many degrees of separation you want to have between yourself and that kind of content. The only definitive thing I will say is that no, you should not engage that kind of content. You should not put nudity and sexual content in front of you because it is designed to provoke that kind of response. So does the game you're playing include that? If so, how much does it include it? And do the mechanics of the game even allow for you to avoid that kind of content? And as far as the issue of more broad anti-Christian themes in the game, do you feel that your supporting of the game ultimately will lead to a support of those agendas? Again, different Christians may come to different conclusions regarding that, but it's important that you maintain a Christian worldview throughout all of this. So in summary, I'll sort of go point by point what I've been trying to say here. One, it's important that we not judge these things one-dimensionally. We should look at these things in terms of what's actually happening in the game and what is happening under the surface. What are the themes being promoted? And what is the ultimate intention of the creator, if it can be discerned? And once we have those categories straight in our head, we can begin to see where we actually should begin to look out for different anti-Christian themes or different forms of visceral content that provoke responses in us that we don't want. In order to accomplish this, should we ultimately disengage from the game altogether, or can we enjoy the game while overlooking these things disapprovingly? And I would say those ultimately are the principles that I at least attempt to live by. Hopefully this has been helpful to you. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video. Make sure you subscribe if you're new to the channel. Again, my name is Eric, and if you do subscribe to the channel, make sure you hit the notification bell so that you can join in future live streams. I tend to stream about 3 times a week. I try to go Monday, Wednesday, Saturday generally, although work sometimes gets in the way and things get rearranged a little bit. But other than that, thank you again for being here, and we will see you again in the next video.